Okay, well, I think we're ready to roll. It falls to me to make a brief introduction to the seminar series. Um, I'd like to begin by saying it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this latest public lecture in our series, Revisiting, Rethinking Tourism, Hospitality and Leisure in the Post-Pandemic World. This series is sponsored by the Centre for Visitor Economy Research, which is based in the School of Management at Swansea University. It also heralds the establishment of our new MSc in International Tourism Management, which will have its first intake in September of this year. Faced with an almost impossible choice about what theme to pick for our series, we decided to think big. So the series therefore addresses one of the most pressing issues of our day, the current COVID pandemic, which has disrupted tourism, hospitality and leisure worldwide. And it looks likely to be, in many ways, a watershed event in history. Despite the disruption and uncertainty, though, one of the good things about COVID is that it's provided some headspace for academics, industry, and policymakers to think again about what tourism, hospitality, and leisure are for, who they are for, and how they might be reconsidered as we transition into a post-pandemic future. So we've set up this lecture series in order to ask some big questions about what tourism, hospitality and leisure stand for in this post-pandemic world. And we've asked some speakers from around the world to deliver the lectures. And we're very pleased today to welcome Professor Stefan Gossling. By way of introduction, and it's going to be very brief, I've taken a short bio from Stefan's university webpage, and I'll just read that to you. Stefan is a professor in the Department of Service Management and Service Studies in Lund University, and also in the School of Business and Economics at Linnaeus University, Kalmar. He works with tourism and transport in the context of sustainability and is specifically interested in climate change, transport policies, transport psychology, and transport economics. He's worked with a wide range of, in a wide range of countries in the European Union, in the Middle East, Africa, Western Indian Ocean, and the Caribbean. And I'd just like to say personally, I've known Stefan for a number of years, and I've worked with him on several projects, from a special edition in a rather obscure journal way back in about 2002 through to working with him co-editing a book and writing a paper on ecological footprinting in the food service industry, which we called food printing, which I have to say is one of my standout moments of inspiration throughout my career. To think that footprinting in food could be called food printing. That was published in 2011, which seems a long while ago. As I was saying to Stefan at the beginning, we were both much younger and wiser men, much younger men when we met, but we're now both wiser men. So before I proceed, just a bit of housekeeping. Most importantly, I'd like to ask you please to keep your microphones muted throughout the duration of the lecture as a courtesy to the speaker, and feel free to keep your cameras off. The best way of experiencing this lecture is to go on speaker view, which is the button you'll find in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And then you'll just see Stefan and his slides, I believe. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, at which point I can ask those who wish to ask their questions in person, if they wish to, and then they can unmute and turn their cameras on if they want to, but that's not necessary. And also, if they want to, if you'd like to ask questions in the chat function, that's possible as well. Although I can't guarantee that I will be able to relate all those questions to you, all those questions to Stefan at the end. It will depend on how many there are. And just to remind you as well that this is being recorded. We're recording it for the purposes of those who can't make it, and it will be available soon on our YouTube channel, which is being set up for the purpose. So let me now hand over to Stefan. It's a delight to welcome you, Stefan, to this lecture series. The title of your lecture, I believe, is, well, we can see it here, Time for Change. Can we think destination models differently? Over to you, Stefan.
Thanks, Brian. When you invited me, I somehow thought this was like an internal lecture for some of the students, and I just got to recycle some of my old stuff and be done with it. So thanks to Tizim then, I learned that you had announced this on Trinet, and fortunately that gave me some opportunity to think about what to really say here today. Because obviously you want to know some stuff or get some thoughts, at least that you haven't had before. And that is always tricky, and I can just promise you that I say some things that you won't like and that will be really provocative, but that's the way probably we need to move forward in this pandemic. I think I should start with saying some things about what has changed, because obviously as humans we are very adaptable, and we always believe that the current now is the now that we are used to. And I chose these two pictures of fences to introduce this kind of notion, because I'm not sure about your neighborhood, but I'm thinking in my neighborhood the fences have been rising in the past couple of months. And probably, if that is not my imagination, it could be some kind of expression of the mental states that we're in, you know. And I wouldn't be surprised. Psychologically, it would make a lot of sense to me, actually, because I think we're in a climate of fear, and there's a vocabulary of war that is being used that builds very much on Beck's risk society. If you think back to 1987 and how Beck introduced risk society, where risks have become global, where individuals can no longer influence their fate because it's taken out of their hands, where different risks become more palatable because of global media and so on. And actually we've been moving through different periods of risk. If you think about the global financial crisis, if you think about the refugee crisis that was specifically severe in Europe, has actually unrooted European politics. We have a far right in virtually any country now. And then the pandemic that has added to this sense of insecurity that is characterizing our societies. And if you ask me what the one common denominator is that characterizes society, then I think it's anxieties these days. We are very much influenced by different anxieties that very often turn into fears. Think about the beginning of the pandemic when everybody made a run for toilet paper, and that became the one common theme. Do I have enough toilet paper to survive this crisis? As if that was the number one item you need in a pandemic. So lots of stories and lessons to be learned right there. But I think what happens when there is fear in society is quite substantial, because it means that you probably withdraw from the common projects, from that what makes society towards fighting for yourself. So far that's been over toilet paper, but I think in the minds of many people it's about more. It's about a sense of survival that is gaining root in many people's heads. And that then goes along with a reduction in empathy and the loss of common goals. And that is it's a huge problem for a society that tries to tackle climate change, for example. And we have also, in a really severe sense, a loss of future here as a result, both economically speaking. I mean, nobody talks about what the impact of all the state aid granted to different people and companies and corporations will be. We are talking about citizenship issues, where we as citizens perhaps don't want to support societal goals anymore. And then there's the level of the individual as a consumer and as a person in society, and how we have changed again, the fence is down here. So all of that is worrying, and it's something that frames the overall picture, I think, at this point in time. Also because we have winners and losers in this game. As always, the losers are not discussed. There's fundamental silence, I think. I'm reading 10 newspapers every morning. I didn't read anything on the situation of children, not much anyway, the occasional article here and there. But we talk about everything, but not what this crisis does to children. And just to pick one example, I took the British Medical Journal here that reminds us that we already had a crisis for children and young people before the pandemic. That their situation got worse all the time, in that the pandemic has made everything worse. And that's, remind you, that's the industrialized world. Think about how this is 10 times worse everywhere else. Then we have the large corporations that have profited from the crisis. As always, the big ones will make it somehow. I read how Jeff Bezos had earned 48 billion in 3 months from March to June, I think last year alone. 48 billion is like what, half the GDP of Denmark or something, and that is a personal gain in profit, not well in wealth. Then we have the large corporations that seem to struggle and still receive state aid while they pay dividends to their shareholders, which is quite strange if you think about it, but apparently not. And then you have the small companies, the SMEs, that are struggling. I'll talk a bit more about all of these things in the context of tourism in a short while. We have also issues related to the state that I think are quite important. This is taken from the Atlantic. I could take any other one. But essentially, we see an erosion of trust in governments. And this is partially related to the different races that we've seen countries doing for tackling this crisis. Some doing well, like Israel. Actually, the UK is doing well in Europe at this point. US seems to be doing well. But in the rest of Europe, for instance, there's a fundamental sense of failure, vaccinations not picking up, problems with deliveries, contracts broken, and all of that tells us something about the government response that is perhaps not as adequate as it should have been. But on the other hand, we can criticize the state all we want. We need it more than ever, because all of our global crisis actually demand that there's a strong state that will set the rules for everyone, because that is what we've learned from the consumer-citizen gap, that as consumers we are not willing to change behavior, but as citizens at least we might be willing to support certain policies that will correct the situation for everyone. So there's complexity here that we need to acknowledge. And I think there's lessons to be learned from what we've seen so far. I think it's fair to say governments were fundamentally unprepared for this crisis, even though we've highlighted these crises or that they might be coming. At least I found in one of my older papers in Global Environmental Change that tourists are both at risk to acquire new infections, and they aid as vectors in the global dispersal of microbes. And then I also refer to air travel as the vector that made it possible. And obviously we've had SARS and MERS since then, so everybody should have known that disease can travel quickly through air transport, and that this is a very real scenario for the future. Yet, a crisis is always a crisis. It's not seen as an opportunity. That's the next thing that strikes me here. We now have this fundamental opportunity to redesign, but most of the time, I think it's back to business as usual. There's an expectation of rebound, and there's not the fundamental kind of preparation to redesign the economy in ways that is more resilient, that is low carbon and everything else. So the reflex is to stabilize the system, and we've learned that in the financial crisis, too big to fail, and then it's a return to old vulnerabilities that probably will characterize the post-pandemic situation, with perhaps on a note a lot more debt than before. And that is surprising, given that if you think climate change, for instance, investing 1 million euros to tackle mitigation was a no-go, but handing out 1 billion to any corporation that is polluting in the current situation is definitely possible. So there's a lot of paradoxes that we might also raise here. What else have we learned? Corporate players will stylize themselves as victims. Look at airlines talking about how important they are for the world economy, how they've been struck with this crisis. But, you know, frankly, I've never sympathized a lot with the aviation system. But in this case, I'm just at a loss, because didn't those guys represent the vector that brought the virus throughout the world in just a few weeks? Then they've received enormous amount of state aid, as I said already. But this has implications, because if you think about airlines, if you think about cruise lines, the state should normally regulate these in terms of climate change, for instance. And by owning the debt to the state, and the state now having become an owner of these companies in that way, all of a sudden the problem is also owned by the state, and I'm not really seeing how the state can address climate change when it's part of the problem. I would also make another observation here. As consumers, we are implicit in these structures of worth. I mean, again, I can only ask this as a question, but where did you shop during the pandemic? Probably you bought a lot of stuff online. Probably you did it through Amazon. Probably you created these global corporations that on other occasions we criticize. So then as citizens, I'm surprised to see how most populations have reacted to governmental force. I mean, we're talking lockdown. We are talking about the most essential human rights in industrial societies, in liberal societies. And yet people have not protested and just accepted all of these cutting downs of their liberties, which is quite surprising to me. And then I also want to raise the role of us as academics in all of this. So, I mean, you've also all noted that all of a sudden some of us academics that usually are ignored most of the years, most of the year became quite famous in terms of their knowledge as virologists and their advice as to how to deal with the pandemic. So that was quite interesting, but I'm also thinking about, you know, our willingness to support change or to defend the status quo, the old rebound. And that is quite an important point I'm going to return to. But we have had these discussions of enablers in the context of the US election, if you remember the likes of the Ted Cruz's and other people who were willing to go out with obviously fake information in order to sway certain voter opinions. All of that is a big mix. I'm bringing all of this into this lecture because I think, you know, we have to start seeing the big picture and where we are drifting and moving from the tiny perspectives towards what is wrong with the system, because I don't think we can fix it if you don't see these big issues. To come up with one example that I followed closely of how Also, the media has been involved in this crisis and how that has affected tourism. A very, very interesting example here from the German Spiegel, which is one of the big news magazines in Germany. And they did a major campaign against Sweden because Sweden was the country with a different strategy towards tackling COVID. And you can see here that there's a graph that shows different countries. Germany seems to be stable in terms of the death rate, and Belgium is also leveling off. Everybody is leveling off, but Sweden seems to be, heading towards disaster. And the title then was "Why Sweden Has Such a Large Number of Deaths," that really killed tourism that summer in Sweden, because nobody wanted to come to Sweden. It was like a country spelling disaster. But it tells us something about, the power of graphics, the power of citizen statistics, as I want to call them, because there's this notion that we're all experts now because we can access graphs and statistics and get our own opinion through social media and so on. But, if I turn around this graph and you see this Swedish curve in terms of the death rate that is going up and up and up and seems to be really, really progressively, dangerously to affect the population. Well, this is another figure that shows the very same graph, but in this case, it's not accumulated death rate. This is the actual development of the death rate. And you can see that from day to day, the death rate in Sweden is actually declining towards zero in the same period of time. And then we had in Sweden the best summer you can imagine, while all of Europe was in lockdown and restricted and so on. We had a fantastic summer with virtually very few deaths and very relaxed rules, just because everybody behaved properly. But that was not the image that was spread by the media in the rest of Europe. Anyway, from there to this question of we are all experts. And I really want to say a few words here on how we are having a dilemma here. In terms of how, as scientists, we are depending on the trust in science. I would argue all of our societies are actually science-based. All the decisions we usually make are science-based. But, there's an erosion in trust in science on the basis of different mechanisms that is quite worrying. And one problem, obviously, is that everyone is now an expert and can judge different things and can have an opinion on different things. And Dan Scott did so fantastically summarize this in the context of climate change a few years ago when he said, when one needs heart surgery, does one seek out an auto mechanic? No, when it comes to your health, you want the real expert. But when it comes to climate change or anything else, it's fine to have your own opinion, right? So there's issues here that I think we should consider in terms of what they really mean. But to go back to tourism and what was wrong with tourism before the pandemic, I think this Swedish ad here is actually a quite current one. Fly two for the price of one. This is exactly an expression of going back to where we were and what wasn't good. The old tourism system was vulnerable. Remember 2018, the one big thing we talked about was over-tourism. Now we have no tourism. We have had the situation of many destinations being very tourism dependent, yet trying to increase arrivals. And we've had certain developments that have made things worse, cheaper flights, load factors down, price competition. This is all we've already seen last summer, and this is going on this year until we have this big rebound, probably when everybody will want to travel again. But the question is any of this good for the tourism systems that we want? Because I would argue we want stability. And some of these developments that we've had in the past are not stable. This is a map of Airbnb and booking properties in Europe, and you can see there's a huge concentration in certain areas. But I think it's fair to say that we have many new we've had many new market entries that led to overcapacity in terms of accommodation in many areas. Overcapacity then led to competition over price. also because of the platform economy, lower prices increase tourism volumes, then destinations often reacted by increasing transport capacity. And then again, we already had that low-cost carrier thing that boosted tourism before that. So that was one very problematic development. Obviously, the aviation industry is worried at this point, but the long-term scenario is, oh, don't worry, we get back to business as usual, which is exactly what we don't want. And why is that? Well, because this is the picture prior to the pandemic. And what you can see here in this graph is the net profit the global aviation system has made per departing passenger in US dollars. And when it's negative, it means that they've made a loss. So over the past 20 years, you can see in many years, airlines have not made profits, that they've actually made losses. And over the last 5 years, there was also a decline in the average profit that was made. And if you add now the financial crisis, I doubt that for the next 10 years, airlines will actually make a profit. They'll just repay the state aid that they've received so far. So the question is, do you want a system that is so economically vulnerable to continue to exist on that basis? Because it has been characterized by overcapacities, and in my opinion, also because of subsidies that have been permanently forwarded to the sector. And then we have seen these massive growth rates that have created all these destination problems. So I really wonder, is this something to go ahead with? Also, the question that can be asked now after the pandemic is, how much tourism do we really need? And I think when it comes to business travel, we have really truly learned, oh, surprisingly, a lot of businesses can do without it. I've myself talked to some very high ranking people in the industry, and they've said, look, it didn't affect us at all. You know, if anything, we have profited from it because people have not been flying the world all the time, costing a lot of money and time. We've done all of this through the internet, all of this online, no problem. So you could probably really question how much business travel we really need, and whether business travel wasn't first and primarily a result of identities that were built on frequent movement rather than the need to meet physically, as has often been stated. Then the conference travel thing is another thing where we have to look into the mirror as academics. And I think even there, it's probably fair to say that we could do with a lot less. I'll leave that to you. It's a very well, it's an issue where a lot of people react violently, but I think very often conference travel, well, come on guys, it's family meetings. It's nothing to do with, we need to do another research project. We have learned to do this online. We can do this online. So at least let's be honest about what we really need to do and what we want to do. And then obviously we have the rest of tourism, where a lot has been ICT fueled. You know that a lot of travel has taken place because of social media needs to communicate, where travel has turned into a necessity rather than something that you can consider an opportunity. All of that needs to be questioned at this point, I think. And then last viewpoint here, perhaps, before I turn to destinations, the reminder that after the pandemic is before the pandemic, because I'm not seeing that anybody is discussing what went wrong, in how future pandemics will be addressed, how they can be avoided in the first place. What we know is that, well, governments can act. That has often been disputed in the past, but we've seen that governments can definitely act. They can restrict things, they can steer things, they can influence things, and the population will follow suit. What we've also learned is, however, that governments have been ill-prepared to act, unfortunately, many times, and then that they are also unlikely to look into the root causes of the problems that we are having. So that are further lessons from the pandemic as far as I see it. So from here to climate change. Why climate change? Well, to me, COVID is the analog to climate change, what we're going to face in the future. There's probably a number of differences. One of the most important differences is that, well, climate change is not going to go away, and there won't be a vaccine. So whatever we have in the future is going to be 10 times worse, and it's going to get not better. In this publication led by Dan Scott, we try to model how the future might look if we face runaway climate change, and which tourism areas in the world face lower or higher risks, and you can see which parts of the world are going to fall away from the global map of travel, where climate change risks are very high. So anything that is orange, red, probably places you won't go see in the future. That means we need to think differently, and this is why we designed already before the pandemic the low carbon destination model for the future. That's James Hyam and I. And we thought there probably need to be 3 pillars to make this destination model viable. The first is an imperative. It's lowering carbon, which we can't avoid. It's something we must do. It's not something you might want to do. And most people still don't understand that. They still talk about climate change as if that was something we might take into consideration if we had a good day. Lowering carbon is the imperative, and that means that we have to change the tourism system. Then secondly, we all know that destinations want to earn money. And I have obviously a full understanding for that. Tourism generates jobs, tourism generates income. We need to maintain that. So rather than questioning tourism per se, we are saying here we need to move away from the volume growth model. We need to move towards a steady state economy where we generate more value in different ways and where we add value. And there's different ways of doing that. So that is the second pillar of this model. And the third is then reducing leakage, because we always seem to think it's perfectly fine to bring in more people to earn more money, but we never wonder about where we are losing money all the time. And this is important issues here that I want to discuss in the next few slides. But first of all, why can we slim air transportation? Which I think is a precondition for low carbon. We are not going to get around it because air transport is the major emission source in tourism. And it's also a system that doesn't work in profitable ways, economically profitable. And this is something that surprisingly has shed a lot of the value that it could generate in recent years. The real cost of air transport has declined by 60% over the past 20 years, says IATA. So I think that is very important to bear in mind here. And then secondly, we have seen too many air transport wants and needs in recent years. Wants to me is when you want to travel by air in certain ways. For instance, you want to travel in business class rather than economy class. That is a want, because the transport purpose can also be fulfilled in economy class. Then the needs are probably linked more closely to visiting friends and relatives and all that kind of thing. But we have a lot of wants, and some of the examples here are from a paper where we discussed this. But essentially, you know, with certain airlines, you can travel at a price that is lower than the cost of the fuel that the airline is using to transport you. So how much sense does that make, is what we wonder. So having said that, how should we look into different parameters then to discuss new destination models? And one of the things we investigated recently was the development of length of stay in tourism. And we found for about the 40% of the global market that we had data for from UNWTO, there was a 14% decline in average length of stay, but this varies really between countries. Some have actually managed to increase the average length of stay, and most obviously have seen a decline in average length of stay. And average length of stay also varies between countries. Like Martinique on top here manages a very high average length of stay, while many countries in Europe have a very low average length of stay. Why is this important? Because if you want more people coming into your country, then, and they will stay for shorter periods of time, you will need more transport infrastructure. To illustrate this for Austria, to generate 100 million guest nights in Austria in 1995 took less than 20 million international arrivals. But in 2015, it already took 27 million international arrivals. So you can see there's a huge difference in terms of how many people have to be churned through the system in order to generate the same outcome economically. Obviously, this is a simplification, but it tells us something about this parameter that we really need to reconsider, because this is really old in the tourism literature, obviously, but we need to go back there and revisit these issues. We also looked into this big myth of the favorable Asian markets to Europe, which is coming up very often here in Europe, where people say that we need to attract more travelers from long haul destinations. But we looked at this on the basis of statistics from Austria. We couldn't find that relationship. It was actually the right opposite. The further away people came from, the shorter the stay in Austria. So if you actually marketed Austria to Asian markets, the effect would probably have been that they came for a few days to Austria, but then went to other European countries because the travel distance was too large to just visit one country. So you've actually lost on that strategy. So again, another myth that we need to bust, and perhaps a development that we have to rethink. Then leakage, another big topic that nobody is discussing. But we all know that the platform economy is monopolistic in its structures. It's extractive. It's also not sustainable from many viewpoints that I can find. And I think it's fair to say that a huge share of the turnover that is made in destinations is flowing to certain platforms for very basic services, if you're honest about it, because a platform is not magic. The thing with a platform is always, do you own the major market share or not? Because if you do, then you can probably extract major money from different markets, in this case globally. And nobody really knows even how much money is extracted from different destinations through the platform economy. All we know is it's major. It's probably for many platforms, like Airbnb extracts 21% from the turnover, so that is quite significant. And I wonder, why isn't there approaches to deal with this? We have the franchise losses, which is also quite interesting. Very often, US franchises everywhere in the world that extract value from destinations, and we seem to think that's just fine. And just to mention this, Ben & Jerry is not your unique family shop. It's actually part of Unilever, last time I looked. We have payment systems, which is also quite interesting, because the worrying thing here is not only that all of these systems charge quite significant sums from anyone making transactions, and we need them as tourism businesses, but we never question how substantial these payments really are that we are making. A lot of colleagues now recently also start to argue for cryptocurrencies and their importance and role, and that is really worrying me, because I've never understood why you want Bitcoin as your payment system. Why would you want currencies not being controlled by governments to start with? Why would you want companies not to pay taxes on their turnover? Why would you want currencies that consume huge amounts of energy to be generated, and not just energy, but also causing emissions then, obviously? None of that is making any sense to me anyway. And I'm really questioning those colleagues advocating for these systems, because it does not seem to be plausible to me that we make the case for cryptocurrencies. So this model then, to be a bit developing here, obviously very much of what I talked about is the industrialized viewpoint, and we need a different viewpoint that is also including other countries, countries with fewer opportunities, with not the kind of money that we have, and with different preconditions for making money or generating systems. So the proposition is here: low carbon, resilient, circular, SDG focused destination model, which is focused on the economy, on carbon SDGs, and circularity, not just in terms of carbon, but resources more generally. And you can see that there is different elements here, from regional economy, local jobs, distribution, and low leakage, that should characterize the economy part. And then there's more SDGs on the other side that are important, that need to be considered. And in the center, you have the carbon storage properties that we could probably make use of in many countries, if you think about the need to forest and maintain forests. And then on the other hand, the huge amount of synthetic fuels that we'll need in the future, which then could be probably funded by international adaptation funds or similar. And why is the syn fuel thing so important, the e-fuel thing? Well, in the future, we still want to travel. We still need transportation. But all of this needs to be running on the basis of some fuel. And the only way I can see is synthetic fuels that will actually power transport systems in the future. And to do that is a huge, huge effort. And nobody's talking about this issue either. But it's part of the circular economy, and we did some calculations on this recently. This just came in environmental research letters. I'm sorry, I forgot the reference here. But what you can see is there is the pink area that is the business as usual trajectory in emissions from aviation, in case we follow the ICAO business as usual scenario. And then you see the blue-greenish area that is different scenarios for feed-in quotas and a carbon tax. And the feed-in quota is the beauty of this model. It would mean that airlines have to increase their share of sustainable fuels by 3% per year until 2050 to fully replace then fossil fuels with synthetic fuels. And you can see that this model would work to actually approach a circular economy. It would just mean an enormous focus on technology, enormous investments, but just a 35% increase in the cost of air travel. So it's feasible in many senses, but we need these models in the future to redefine tourism. The overall challenge, and I'm almost through here with my presentation, but the overall challenge then is for us to design systems where emissions go down, as you can see here in this illustration, in where we still have an expectation that GDP and revenue are going up. I think it's more suitable for all of us to focus on profitability in the future, or even new indicators that consider how much money is going around in the local economy, or creating jobs locally, that kind of thing. But we need to start thinking about, creating more value at a lower carbon input. Otherwise, we are not going to combine the economic and the environmental. And that is a key issue I think we need to address in future research. So where are the roadblocks to all of this? I think our main problem is the thinking of DMO managers. Unfortunately, it's the volume growth trap. They are all in. I've talked to many. I've never seen anyone questioning the volume growth model. Is the more the better, and that's end of discussion. Policymakers, I'm not even aware of many that have questioned or dealt with destination models, but we also need to politicize this whole issue of where we are drifting and what is wanted, and I think where you have had over-tourism issues, some policymakers have started to actually look into this, like in Barcelona and other cities, but we need that more. We need more policymakers to start questions. And then we also need to rethink our own viewpoints. I'm still feeling like the odd person who is questioning the tourism system after all these years. I think most colleagues are supportive of growth. I mean, all the aviation economists are impossible to get even a bit critical perspective on air transport. So where are we in all of this? You know, I really wonder what that all means in terms of our academic standing and our academic role as being critical observers of the system. And I also want to raise the issue of supranational organizations, because I'm so fundamentally disappointed over UNWTO and ICAO, who, in my opinion, are supranational organizations that are supposed to work for the greater goods of humanity, that are supposed to not just pay lip service to the SDGs, rather than to find ways to implement them. And when you look beyond their rhetorics, I think they're just industry lobby organizations, plain and simple. Tell me anything that would differentiate them from a conventional industry lobby, and I'll be happy to listen, because I don't see these differences. So in short, last slide. I came across this book. It just came out a few months ago by a colleague in Sweden, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And that obviously made me cringe, because, you know, violence, really? But, you know, I'll give you one quote from this book. Imagination is a pivotal faculty here. The climate crisis unfolds through a series of interlocked absurdities ingrained in it. Not only is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, it is also easier, at least for some, to imagine learning to die than learning to fight. And honestly, I've been thinking for this for at least a week, and not just this, the whole book. And it made me realize how we are all sitting ducks, you know, and how the old, you know, view on academia is something that is totally aside and pure and not just unlocking is probably overcome. We are no longer just independent actors. We are actually, if you think about the modern corporate university, we are part of all of this already. So why not face it and question what we are, who we are, what we want to be in this kind of game? Because I think the role that society wants us to play is a different one. It's to be critical of the developments. It's to highlight where developments are not in favor of society. And all of that would force us to really think differently about a number of assumptions that we just take for granted. I think we really need to rethink how often we just look on and do another project. I really want to raise this as my provocative statement at the end of this section. And yeah, perhaps we can have some kind of discussion on all of this. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's some virtual applause going on, but everybody's staying on mute, which is wonderful. Thank you for doing that. I even see some hands arriving. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Yes, we do appreciate you very much for that very stimulating and thoughtful talk, Stefan. And I'm sure you've raised no end of questions. I've got a couple on the chat, but I was just wondering if first we had any body would like to ask one live. If you wish to, does anybody wish to raise a hand? Or I can't see everybody on the screen, but I'm looking. Could raise a real or a virtual hand if you have a question. I don't see anybody yet. So I'll ask one which came through, is coming through the chat. So one from Julia Fallon. Years ago, there was a belief that video conferencing would replace business travel, and yet no change happened. Why do you think that business travel, why do you think that business travel will stop when there is a need to connect to make deals?
Oh, well, the first out, there's always a spectrum of explanations for behavior. There's never just black and white. So let me pick a black example to show that probably a lot of business travel is redundant. Think about mileage runs. Mileage runs are flights that you do in order to stay within a certain status class, and they are not really related to any other motive than to stay in a certain status class. And that probably is very important to the individual doing this, but I would think most people in society would say, well, that's not really what we need or what people need to do, right? So there's one example. We have other examples where we've, my own research has focused on asking in one project students how many of their flights they would rate as very important and how many they would rate as not important at all. The 5 like-it scale. They didn't know this was about climate change, and it's surprising. They said like 42% of all flights were not very important or important. So there's many examples, I think, as to why business travel is less important than we think. Sometimes business travelers are forced to participate in certain flights, and sometimes they want to participate in certain flights because it's part of their lifestyle, it's part of their identity, and that then trumps other issues, and that is probably the reason why they are not then participating in video conferences. But now in this new situation where we've all been forced to move towards video conferencing, I think we've seen that less conference or business travel is necessary.
Okay, thank you. Another question now coming from an, forgive me if I can't pronounce your name correctly, Kaula Al-Muhannandi.
Yes, you pronounced it correct. Thank you very much. I'm Khawla, I'm from Bahrain. I want to thank you very much, Stefan, for giving such unconventional, inspiring presentation. It's not often to hear an academic view in tourism considering the good, the common good, and the climate change in this clear approach. When I was listening to you, and I come from an NGO, I come from environmental NGO, and I major in sustainable tourism. As if I was listening to an NGO point of view, and this is not often happening. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. You're almost speaking what's in our mind. And I would like very much, Stefan, if possible, to communicate with you and discuss some of the views that we have, and maybe write something together. Thank you.
Well, yeah, just a short response. Obviously, academics should argue academically on the basis of facts, and always be ready to find that we didn't find what we thought we would find, right? But it's probably also a true fear that looking into these issues, very often you will come to the same conclusion. It doesn't really matter if you're an academic or coming from an NGO or being a politician. It's just if you open your mind to all the facts, then very often the conclusions we should draw will be rather similar.
Yeah, I agree, Stefan, if I may just add this. I think if we are aiming to move forward, especially in the post-pandemic planning, it's very important to rethink what's happening. It's very important not to go back to business as usual there is a very good suggestions from many places. I come from Middle East, that big corporations supported by government are just waiting for the pandemic to go so that they go back to business as usual, as if nothing happened, as if this is something that did not happen for reasons, as if no analysis is needed at all. So I think what you presented today is very important, and it should not stay just as a view. I think it should be developed further, especially by research, and provide solutions for the time when governments are ready to rebuild the economy again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. Thank you. Can I move on now to some of the questions, some more of the questions that are coming up on the chat. One from Jackie Clark. Increasing length of stay and corresponding use of slow travel requires a fundamental societal restructuring of flexible blocks of leisure time and away from existing annual leave entitlements, which are very limiting in many countries, Europe being somewhat leisure rich as against Asian countries, etc. So do you see other ways that leisure time is being restructured post-pandemic?
Yeah, I think that is probably one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic, isn't it? That we've all become more flexible in terms of how we work. A lot of people work from home at this point. There's greater flexibility in that. I could imagine that, I mean, think about the consequences just structurally. Staying at home just one day per week, if the whole workforce did that, obviously not everybody can, but just as an example, if that was the average, then 20% of the commuter traffic would disappear. If it wasn't the same day, they would all stay at home, which would resolve many traffic problems. Could potentially slash emissions from commuting by 20% right away. Then this flexibility taken over to leisure time and holidays. I mean, obviously there's always the school issue that is hard to deal with, but for everybody else, I could imagine that there's a greater openness now for people not only to be more flexible in terms of their leisure time, but also how they want to structure, you know, the job and the holiday balance. I could imagine that a lot of people would say, look, I'll just take half my holiday and then or I'll take twice as many holidays, but I'll work half the time, for instance. So combine work and leisure, which a lot of people have done in the past. I think there's, you know, there is not one model. There's 1,000 models if you just start thinking about it. But the important thing is that we start thinking, that we not let this pass by as another opportunity that we'll look back on in sorrow, that nobody has done anything to actually make use of it. So I'm just saying, whatever. It would be great to test different models. It would be great to try and find new solutions. Just let's not go back to business as usual. That is the one big mistake we could make.
Thank you. And one from Breno Costa. One of the best strategies to reduce the use of cars in tourism is to use public transport when traveling within a destination. However, how can we suggest to a tourist to use public transport after COVID? So is there any reasonable modal choice in this case?
Oh, that is such a complex question.
Sorry.
The answer is actually right here. It's by coincidence, but it's on my desk. It's a book I wrote in 2017, The Psychology of the Car. I was thinking we will never change transport systems if we don't understand why people are so stuck with the car. And since I really deep dived into this, my understanding of car driving has fundamentally changed. You know, it's nothing to do with getting from A to B. There's so many different things involved. If you want to make people use different transport systems, well, the short answer is they have to be better than the car. And then there's a lot of ways to get there, actually, both by you know, providing incentives, and then also by using sticks. But it's a very complex question. And yeah, you don't want to talk about it right now because people have good reason to fear public transport and they feel entitled to use the car. I mean, look at what's happening in the car fleet. People are buying bigger cars. They are buying cars with more, with greater motorization. All of these things point in the very wrong direction, if you ask me, and then it's a result of fears. Again, so we need to build empathetic societies. I think that is a starting point for everything.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the tendency, I don't know if it still continues, but a few years ago when people in Britain were buying big, heavy four-wheel drive cars to take their children to school in the morning, even though they lived in the cities, because they felt that it was safer than them walking. And it was, they were big, strong cars, and therefore if there was a crash, the kids wouldn't be injured. And I think we called them Chelsea tractors at one stage. In as much as, you know, driving, the decision whether to go on the bus or walk or take the car is a very complex one. And the health considerations now just complicate that even further. So I think it's a very complex question. Alan File, all the way from sunny Florida.
Hi, Stefan. Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. I did try and do a question earlier on, but my screen froze, as is typical with Zoom occasionally. Just a couple of points, really. I know time is tight. I think two positives that I've noticed here, because obviously Florida's a hugely important sort of tourist economy. But I think the first thing, over the past year, there's been a huge positive rediscovery of the local, in the sense that Floridians have discovered that Florida is so much better than what you just see on the postcard. So state parks in particular, a lot of the coastlines, places that people have never been for years and years, have all of a sudden appeared, and they've always been there. So there's been a huge sort of reconnection with sort of old Florida, so to speak. It's funny, I sort of agree with you with the moral convulsion. You know, there's been a lot of negativity, but the flip here has been, and you never get this on the media, and I think that's part of the challenge, a huge engagement with voluntary activity by local residents. So be it food banks or anything of that ilk. Okay, it's tough that these things are needed, but it's been a really huge positive that I hadn't really seen before. But it's never on the media. It just, you know, you just don't see it. And the third point is certainly here, there's a huge, believe it or not, a lot of the cities in Florida are very, very progressive with the use of the SDGs. Again, you don't tend to see it, but there's a lot going on. It's not carrying through to the destinations. So the challenge here is what is being done at a residential level, for the most part, is very positive, but it's not necessarily carrying through to the destination. And I think the big problem, it always comes down to money. The industry, from what I'm seeing, they accept that the industry is vulnerable. It's always been vulnerable. It always will be vulnerable to varying degrees. But the income or the revenue and the tax receipts are so enormous, particularly here, that they're accepting the vulnerabilities because the economic returns are just so big. And that's probably the single biggest challenge we've got here for change. Lots of people are talking about change, but they see that economic return. Orange County, where I live, gets around $230 million every single year from bed taxes. It's huge sums of money. So that economic return is the principal stumbling block at the moment. So no real sort of question, but a bit of a rambling, you know, there's some of the things that we're seeing here. Just any thoughts?
Good points. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Brian, I didn't feel like I need to comment on that.
No, that's fine. That's
I
fine.
obviously agree with everything Alan is saying. And yeah, we didn't talk about the positive changes. Think leisure. I mean, outdoor recreation has increased enormously. People are using bikes. They are walking. A lot of positive things have changed. I mean, one of the huge winners of this crisis in Europe is the bicycle industry. They have, I think, at least doubled turnover, because you couldn't get bicycles anymore. They were virtually sold out in stores. So many positive things, and we shouldn't, forget about them. Definitely there, and not for me to try to omit them.
Some more questions from online, if you're still happy to continue, Stefan, for a few more minutes. One was from Eileen Edwards. From her perspective, the general population needs to recognise the need for change. The growing distrust in governments, industry and science, how do you feel that society as a whole can change our behavioural patterns? Things like unsustainable travel, overconsumption, especially post-pandemic.
Yeah, that to me actually is one of the positive outcomes of the past 2 years, that we've seen lots of debates on these issues. I mean, I felt virtually like I've been working with climate change for 25 years. 20 years I was ignored, another 3 hated, and the last 2 years, all of a sudden things look brighter. And we had Fridays for Future. We had people discussing food. We had talks about regional economy. We had all these positive developments coming out of the pressure that really, well, the Fridays for Future movement has brought onto the streets. I mean, in some countries, we've had the greatest demonstrations in post-war times in Europe because of climate change. And if we go back to that, if we manage to go back to that, these new social movements have been wielding an enormous power over social norms, and we've even done research on that, and could say, yeah, it's for real. People talk, people do change behavior. It's not something that is theoretical anymore. So I think the social norms that we've been discussing, they are really the key to things, and that obviously also means that we have to get rid with some idols and some of the norms that we are following through certain people, where, for instance, celebrities are advertising certain lifestyles that are not really sustainable for anyone to follow. But by and large, I think we've made a huge progress over the past 2 years towards actually approaching change.
Anybody else got a question they'd like to give? I see Tazim.
Yes, Brian.
Yeah, I see you unmute. So are you ready to ask a question?
I did put it in the chat to see if I can organize my own thoughts. But first of all, Stefan, thank you so much. You've encapsulated, I think, a lot of points, concerns, worries, and together package them in very, very good facts, statistics, and data, as you always do. So thank you. But I do want to sort of ask a question before everyone disappears, which I raised at numerous workshops and conferences in 2019, prior pandemic, and got similar responses. We academics are enabling the system. You ask your students, and in fact, I put this, my students this semester right now, doing their carbon footprint exercise. And I asked them, undergrad students, do we let Greta Thunberg and the youth leave classes and their schoolwork to be able to protest and ask for responsibility? So you're telling us we need to do more. But the question is, what more? At every place I've raised this, we're unwilling to face the structural challenges at a global level. We can think local very well. I think I see a lot of people in the audience here who do a lot of work at the local level, but you're raising a global governance issue and global structural changes. And the UNTO is obviously not capable of doing a lot of what needs to be done, it seems. I think you mentioned it yourself. So what then do we do, and how do we actually advance social movements? What do we take away from how to blow up a pipeline? You must have some thoughts to share with us, because otherwise I'm going to leave a little more in despair and less of hope.
Oh, you're adding pressure here.
Yep.
Sure. You're right. My thoughts are as ever evolving day by day. And my current thinking is that probably if, for instance, we as academics took a more critical stance to what's been said by UNWTO, by ICAO, by other supranational organizations, WTTC, I think we could question them all easily in research terms, by analyzing their discourses, by looking into what is action and what is narrative. There's many ways of exposing the frail structures that they are and the non-action that is taking place. But we don't do, because most of the time I look into the field, I see more colleagues being totally fine, trying to get close to the sector. I mean, we've had cases where universities have awarded applied professorships to people from industry in order to get closer to industry. I could probably call this sucking up to industry, but rather than taking the academic critical distance to things. And perhaps we need to start there and call them out for what they are doing, because I don't think it's academia. We shouldn't do this. It's not academic behavior to provide a professorship to someone who doesn't even know what academic writing means in the first place. That is one thing we could do. I think we can also, focus on our research more on the black boxes that we have in the system. We don't know nothing about corruption. We don't know nothing about, how certain policies are made or unmade, how industry is using its lobbying forces in order to prevent progress. So much more has been done in other science sectors and other fields in order to disentangle these processes. Look at climate change in the media and how much research has been done there. We haven't done that in tourism studies. We like to focus on the pleasant work, like my students a few years back. Oh, we just booked flights to South Africa. Oh yeah, okay. What is your master going to focus on? Oh, we don't know yet. It's this kind of attitude that deeply annoys me because it obscures that many of us are tourists more than academics. And I want to say this, and some people are going to hate me for that, but somebody needs to say it. It's about time, we need to become critical towards the system, yes, but also towards ourselves and our roles in being the system.
Indeed. Well said, Stefan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. One more question. Sorry to anybody who hasn't had their question asked. Albert, did you want to ask a question? Would you like to come online, or would you rather I read it?
Hi, Brian.
There you
talking
are.
to me. Hi there. Sorry, I'm used to hear my name in Italian. Apologies.
Oh, sorry, Albert.
Wait,
sorry.
no worries. Thanks. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Stefan, for the presentation. Very quickly, I think it's a follow-up to what Jamal was saying. In regards to, rather than talking about business as usual, probably it is about challenging policy as usual. So moving forward for what has been the current process and governance with the over-reliance on institutions like the UNWTO, ICAO, and any other body that, let's say, is seen globally as the people that know what tourism is. Probably it's about challenging this current status quo and moving forward to a new thinking, actually rethinking following your presentation. And what is our role? Should we be the ones that actually proactively engage in such change and are the enablers of this change at the local level? Because after all, destinations are something localized. What do you think on this?
I think we already have a double role as advisors, and you know, there's a lot of applied research going on. Not everything we do is just basic science. Sure, we should cooperate with destinations. We should guide them. I think there's also a great number of consultancies out there that will do that job. But essentially, we need an upscaling of these things. We really need, you know, a major initiative that it's not just a few destinations that are then highlighted as, you know, the game changers, when in reality the whole system continues on the beaten track. I think whichever way we go, I mean, there's not just one way. A transition theory would say, you know, whichever way is fine, because from all these different ways we can learn which ones are successful and which ones are not. In my opinion, it starts with perhaps opening our minds to the greater challenge, and then starting to ask the bigger questions, really.
Okay, thank you. That's a great place to leave it, I think, isn't it? Opening our minds and asking about the bigger questions. We began with big questions and we've ended with the big questions. So it just remains for me then to say thank you, first of all, to Stefan for such a thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. And thank you to the audience today. Thank you all for being there out there in the ether. And thank you for those who asked questions. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to get through them all. And just to remind everybody that this is a monthly guest lecture. Next month, we have Professor David Fennell from Brock University, Canada, who's going to be talking to us the same day. So it's the first Wednesday of the month, and it will probably be about the same time, about 4 p.m. UK time. So again, thank you, Stefan. Very kind of you to give us this talk, and you've given us a great deal to think about. Thank you very much.
Thanks all, and bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Stefan. Bye.